Yeah, just to continue here. Sorry. While I am not condoning intentionally ignoring a client, engineers are becoming increasingly more responsible in an effort to continue to expand business operations. I can understand, especially if the client did not make relentless attempts, that this engineer would be negligent in returning correspondence with the client. I don't believe this should be considered an ethical lapse by any means. And that was really a question I wanted you to think about, whether this really did constitute a real ethical lapse. Rather, irresponsibility and imprudent by the engineer. After all, if the engineer is willing to lose business to the prospective client, that is ultimately his sacrifice. Well, that's the question here. Whether not getting back to a client really constitutes anything but just being imprudent, just being impractical. If it's a business matter, it's a business matter. And if business matters don't entail ethical ones ever, then it's not an ethical one. Now, that's questionable. I mean, many people would say that there's all sorts of ethical constraints that we follow, ethical principles that we need to follow in business. Some people would say no. Well, that really is the question. Again, I think oftentimes in engineering ethics, it is good to think about similar situations in other more widely recognized professions, especially medicine. If a doctor did not get back to his or her client for 3 weeks, would you consider that to rise to an ethical lapse? Most people would say yes. So if you are a professional and you're an engineer as a professional, you're saying that it's okay, that it's not an ethical lapse for you to do the same thing. I mean, I'm not saying that decides the question, but it does point up the underlying issue, is whether you really take engineering seriously as a profession. If you do, then clearly this was an ethical lapse. It wasn't just imprudence. If you don't really take engineering seriously as a profession, and believe me, this is a philosophy class in which things are open, right? Questions are open. You can definitely make a good case that engineering is not a profession, right? But if you don't think it's a profession, then it's probably not an ethical lapse. It's stupid to do if you want to be successful, but you haven't committed any kind of moral infraction. I really think it's a good case because it does force us to think about this underlying question about whether we really seriously think. Because I think anybody would say that a doctor who just leaves a patient in the dark for 3 weeks, doesn't return their calls, it's not just being imprudent. It's probably a really serious infraction in medical ethics. Yes, I don't think taking the trip was such a big deal. Sure, it was shady for the engineer to get one over on the employer, but I'm sure the employer already planned for that. Well, maybe they did. I have to say, but that's not really the point, whether the employer planned for it or not. I mean, the point is the behavior of the young engineer. Yes, it was shady. And you know what? We act shady in life. We're all shady sometimes, some of us more than others. I'm sure some of you are fine, upstanding people and much better than me. But there's shadiness, and then there's doing things which risk your integrity. Really, the question here is not whether what the engineer did really result in any sort of damages in reality to the employer. The question is whether he engaged in a deceptive act. And there's enough ambiguity in the circumstances of the case, the facts of the case, to maybe argue that he didn't engage in deception. But to say that he did, then, I guess the idea is the difference between engaging in a small deception in your private life and engaging in a small deception in your professional life. They have a different value. They have a different quality, is the idea. If you were to do something like this outside of your identity as an engineer, it would have a different value because it is inside, done as an engineer, as a prospective employee. And again, it doesn't have any relevance to the fourth canon because there's no client or employer here. It much more generally has to do with integrity, honesty, and avoiding deceptive acts. It is a small thing, but if you think that the engineer did take advantage of the prospective employer, then I would say it's a serious matter. Now, again, this really all depends upon the seriousness with which we take professional identity of engineers. If we don't take that seriously, it's probably nothing more than an ordinary peccadillo. If we do take it seriously, it rises to something of a different level. Not that it's supposed to provoke conversation and different opinions. I don't have the last say on any of this. So, okay, this is something I'll do occasionally. Obviously, I got excited and did 4 or 5 videos, but that's what happens. So, okay. I'll probably do another one in a couple weeks or whenever we're finished the second.